It started as a quiet morning on the ranch, the kind that carries a stillness only found miles from the nearest town. The grass was slick with dew, and the sound of distant cattle echoed against the open hills. For years, life here had been simple: fencing, feeding, fixing things that needed fixing. The land had belonged to the narrator's family for generations, a stretch of open country bordered by an old private road leading out to the main highway. That road, though rarely used, had always been theirs, surveyed, registered, and deeded into the property line since before the local subdivision even existed. But peace never lasts long when entitlement meets opportunity. It began with tire tracks, fresh, wide, and deep, pressed into the soft dirt near the gate one early morning, the kind made by city SUVs with more shine than purpose. The narrator had noticed them right away, a little too close to the gate that separated the ranch from the newly built Whispering Oaks community. The HOA had recently expanded, buying up adjacent lots and installing their decorative street lamps, their little manicured lawns, and their sense of control. The gate, a simple steel bar barrier, was meant to keep cattle in and strangers out. But apparently, it had become an inconvenience to some of the new neighbors. Over the next few weeks, the signs grew clearer: scratches on the hinges, scuff marks on the latch, and eventually, the unmistakable bend of metal that comes from being forced open. Someone had driven through it. The narrator repaired it once, then again. Each time, the damage grew worse. The second time, the gate was pushed almost off its post. By the third, tire tracks led straight through the mud, carving a path up the ranch road like a scar. And that's when it became clear. It wasn't just a random trespass. It was deliberate. Word soon reached the narrator from a neighboring farm. The new HOA president, a woman named Karen Whitmore, had been boasting that she had every right to use that road. She claimed it was part of an easement, something she said had existed long before the ranch owner's time. She was wrong, of course. The narrator knew the land's history better than anyone. There was no easement, no shared road, no agreement. The path was private, always had been. But Karen didn't see it that way. Over the next few days, the narrator started noticing more signs of intrusion: dusty footprints near the gate, bits of paint scraped off where her vehicle must have hit, and security footage showing her shiny white SUV rolling casually through the barrier as if it weren't even there. She didn't just drive through. She waved at the camera as she passed, as though daring anyone to stop her. Then came the letters, thin envelopes stamped with the HOA's logo, delivered by hand to the ranch mailbox. They were written in polite but condescending language, accusing the narrator of obstructing a community easement, restricting traffic, and interfering with the rights of residents. Each letter came with an escalating threat: a fine, a lawsuit, and finally, a claim that the HOA would seek to remove the illegal barrier if it wasn't taken down voluntarily. It was surreal, being accused by people who didn't even own the land they were driving across. But that's the nature of arrogance. It thrives in ignorance and multiplies when challenged. The narrator filed a report with the sheriff's office, but the deputy's words offered little comfort. Without direct confrontation or injury, it was a civil matter. They suggested hiring a lawyer, so the narrator did, and the lawyer confirmed what they already knew. The land was theirs, the gate was legal, and the HOA had no rights to use that road. But paper and proof mean little when the other side doesn't respect either. The very next day, the narrator found the gate completely torn from its hinges, lying in the ditch, twisted like scrap metal. That was the breaking point. From that moment, the narrator decided that fixing the gate wasn't enough. It was time to send a message. Not through confrontation or lawsuits, but through preparation. Quiet, patient, deliberate preparation. The first step was to rebuild, but differently this time. Instead of another flimsy steel gate, the narrator commissioned a reinforced barrier, steel tubing thick enough to stop a truck, welded into a concrete base buried deep underground. They didn't stop there. Cameras were upgraded, new motion sensors installed, and hidden posts set along the road to record every vehicle that crossed the line. But even then, something inside whispered that Karen wouldn't stop. She'd made it personal now. It wasn't just about access or convenience. It was about control, about proving she could get her way, no matter who owned what. She'd become obsessed with the idea that this private ranch road belonged to her community. And when entitled people feel cornered, they tend to lash out. So the narrator decided to be ready for that too. For weeks, the trap was being set. Carefully, quietly, and legally. Every new bolt, every inch of reinforced fence, every document notarized and filed with the county recorder's office was part of a larger plan. Karen and her board were so busy laughing at their little victory that they didn't realize they were walking straight into it. And one night, when the moon hung low and silver over the plains, the narrator watched from the porch as headlights appeared again in the distance. They followed the familiar path, speeding up as they neared the gate. But this time, the gate didn't move. Not an inch. The SUV didn't stop either. The sound that followed was deafening. Metal on metal, glass shattering, tires skidding into dust. The vehicle crumpled against the unyielding steel like a toy. And as the dust settled, the narrator simply turned off the porch light and dialed the sheriff. Karen had met the first part of the trap, the physical one. But this was only the beginning. Because the true trap, the one made of evidence, ownership records, and legal filings, was still waiting to spring. And when it did, it wouldn't just crush her car. It would crush her entire HOA. Morning broke with the sharp cry of crows circling over the ranch road, their black silhouettes twisting in the orange dawn. The smell of burned rubber lingered in the cool air, mixing with dust and engine oil. The once shiny white SUV now sat crumpled against the immovable steel of the new gate, its hood folded in like paper, the windshield a spiderweb of cracks. For the narrator, it wasn't triumph that followed, but a heavy, quiet calm. The plan had worked exactly as intended, and yet the real storm was only just forming on the horizon. By the time the sheriff arrived, word had already spread through Whispering Oaks. Residents in pastel robes gathered near their manicured fences, whispering to one another as flashing blue lights painted their faces. The HOA president, Karen Whitmore, had made quite the spectacle of herself, standing by her ruined vehicle, screaming about private property, illegal barriers, and lawsuits. She claimed she'd been injured, though she walked without so much as a limp. Her pride had taken the greater blow. The deputies, however, weren't sympathetic. They'd seen the surveillance footage, the clear no trespassing signs, and the county maps verifying ownership. The narrator's paperwork was meticulous, date-stamped, notarized, and filed in duplicate. There was no easement, no community road, and no legal reason for anyone to be driving through that gate. The sheriff gave his verdict simply. "This isn't your land, me. I am." But Karen wasn't one to admit defeat. That very afternoon, a letter arrived, an official HOA notice, stamped and signed, accusing the narrator of creating a public hazard and intentionally causing property damage. The irony was almost impressive. The HOA board, led by Karen and her closest allies, demanded the immediate removal of the dangerous obstruction and threatened to sue for reckless endangerment. For the narrator, this was expected. It was the second phase of the trap, the phase that relied on Karen's arrogance to dig her own hole deeper. Every complaint she filed, every false claim she made, would now become evidence. As the week unfolded, the story spread beyond the neighborhood. Locals who'd once ignored HOA squabbles began to take notice. The nearby feed store, the diner, even the post office were buzzing with talk of the woman who tried to drive through private land and crashed her SUV. Some sided with her, calling the rancher petty and old-fashioned. Others saw the truth. an HOA president who thought she could bulldoze her way through someone else's property. Meanwhile, the narrator's lawyer worked quietly behind the scenes, filing for a restraining order and gathering every shred of documentation, surveys, title deeds, even drone photos showing where the HOA's claimed easement ended miles short of the ranch boundary. Each piece fit perfectly into the puzzle being assembled. Karen, however, refused to stop. She doubled down, holding an emergency HOA meeting where she stood before her neighbors in the clubhouse and painted herself as the victim. She spoke of community access and abuse of rural privilege, twisting the story into a fight for the rights of the subdivision. And for a while, she convinced a few. They signed petitions, shared posts online, and even began harassing the narrator with drive-bys and phone calls. But for every supporter she gained, 2 more began to doubt her. Some residents started asking questions. Why did the community need that road? Why had Karen been driving there in the first place? Why were HOAF funds being used for a private lawsuit against a rancher? Cracks began to form in her control. The once united HOA board now sat in uncomfortable silence as Karen's temper flared. Behind closed doors, she became obsessed. She had her attorney file a civil suit claiming the ranch road was a public right-of-way, citing fabricated historic maps and decades-old rumors about shared access. But the narrator's lawyer was already prepared. County land records, archived photographs, and even testimonies from former owners proved otherwise. The so-called easement had never existed. What did exist, however, was a pattern of trespassing, property damage, and harassment, all neatly documented and time-stamped. And as the legal gears began to turn, the narrator made sure one last piece of evidence found its way to the right hands: the security footage from that night. The video showed everything in chilling clarity. Karen's SUV speeding through the dark, headlights flaring, the moment of impact, and her stepping out, unharmed but fuming, yelling into the night. When the county review board saw it, the narrative shifted instantly. What had been a messy neighborhood dispute now looked like criminal trespass. Still, Karen persisted. She filed complaints with the sheriff's office, the zoning board, even the county commissioner. Each one was dismissed in record time. Her reputation, once untouchable within Whispering Oaks, began to crumble. Neighbors who once admired her organization now avoided her altogether. She started showing up at community events red-eyed and furious, claiming conspiracies, ranting about corruption in the system. But the narrator remained silent, steady, and calm. Every insult, every accusation was met with paperwork, patience, and precision. They knew the real weapon wasn't anger, it was evidence. When the court date finally arrived, Karen was confident she'd wound it in. She strutted into the courthouse in a crisp suit, flanked by her attorney and a handful of board members. She thought she was about to crush a stubborn rancher under the weight of HOA authority. But what she didn't know was that the narrator's lawyer had already filed a counterclaim, one that turned the entire case on its head. As testimony began, the truth unfolded piece by piece. The footage played. The property deeds were read. The original developer's statements were entered into record. And by the end of the first session, even the judge's patience was wearing thin with Karen's bluster. The HOA's case was weak, built on assumptions and arrogance. Outside the courthouse that day, Karen's SUV sat in the parking lot, freshly repaired but still bearing the faint dent along its grille. A silent reminder of the night her pride collided with reality. The narrator watched from a distance, knowing that the real reckoning hadn't even begun yet. The counterclaim was moving forward, one that would expose not only Karen's lies, but the HOA's misuse of funds, their fraudulent filings, and their systematic harassment. Whispering Oaks had started this war over a gate. But soon they'd learn that the gate was never the real trap. It was everything that came after. The weeks leading up to the court's next hearing were tense, silent but heavy. like the calm before a storm. Whispering Oaks had once been a pristine neighborhood, a cluster of picture-perfect homes built on the illusion of order and control. But beneath that manicured surface, cracks were spreading fast. Rumors about Karen's lawsuit had turned neighbors against one another. Some whispered that she'd lost her mind. Others believed she was still fighting for a cause, though even they couldn't explain what that cause really was anymore. Meanwhile, on the ranch, things had shifted. The narrator had learned long ago that when facing people like Karen, patience wasn't weakness. It was a weapon. Every document filed, every motion approved, every record pulled from the county archives was another brick in the wall closing in around the HOA. The counterclaim wasn't just for trespassing or damage, it was for fraud, defamation, and malicious prosecution. Karen had stepped too far into territory she didn't understand, and now the narrator was using her own arrogance as the rope to hang her case with. The evidence was overwhelming. There were months of security footage showing repeated trespassing by HOA members. Karen's SUV wasn't the only one caught on camera. Other residents had followed her lead, cutting across the ranch road whenever it suited them. There were recorded HOA meetings where she had openly admitted to forcing the issue, and there were bank statements, leaked by a former board member, that revealed HOA funds being funneled into her legal crusade. That leak changed everything. It began when a man named Alan Porter, one of the original homeowners and a retired engineer, finally spoke out. He had grown tired of Karen's bullying and the endless rise in HOA fees. When he discovered that a portion of those fees had been used to pay for private legal representation and consulting costs tied to the lawsuit, he'd had enough. He resigned from the board and sent copies of the invoices directly to the county clerk's office and to the narrator's attorney. The discovery sent ripples through Whispering Oaks. Suddenly, residents began demanding transparency. Emergency meetings turned chaotic. Karen shouted down anyone who questioned her, labeling them ungrateful and traitors. Her voice, once commanding, now trembled with desperation. The HOA that had once stood firmly behind her began to splinter into factions. The narrator, however, didn't need to lift a finger. The damage was unfolding naturally. The trap was doing exactly what it was designed to do, tightening slowly, quietly, and irreversibly. When the next hearing arrived, the courtroom atmosphere was electric. Ren's once confident demeanor had been replaced by agitation. Her attorney looked worn and uncertain. The narrator sat calmly, hands folded, eyes forward, letting the process play out. The judge began by addressing the counterclaim, noting that new evidence had been submitted. Financial records, video footage, and sworn affidavits from former HOA board members. Karen's lawyer objected repeatedly, but the objections fell flat. The judge allowed everything into record. Then came the footage, the moment everyone had been waiting for. It played in silence, the bright headlights cutting through darkness, the white SUV speeding up the dirt road, the sudden crash into the reinforced gate. The entire courtroom watched as the vehicle shuddered to a stop, and Karen stepped out, unharmed, waving her arms in fury. When the lights came back on, there was no denying what had happened. The narrator hadn't set a trap meant to harm. It had been a simple act of self-protection, reinforced by legal right and documented warnings. The court saw through Karen's story of reckless endangerment. What they saw instead was a pattern of reckless entitlement. But the real blow came when the financial records were presented. The HOA's spending on legal fees exceeded their annual maintenance budget. Thousands of dollars in homeowner dues had been funneled into Karen's personal case, without board approval or resident consent. The judge's tone grew colder with each revelation. By the time the session ended, the HOA's credibility was shattered. The judge dismissed their claims entirely and ordered a preliminary investigation into financial misconduct. Karen's attorney withdrew from the case the following week, citing irreconcilable differences. What followed was chaos back in Whispering Oaks. The neighborhood was in open rebellion. Flyers appeared on mailboxes calling for Karen's resignation. Anonymous notes circulated online, exposing her for the lies she'd spun. Neighbors who once avoided the rancher's property now drove past slowly, their faces filled with a mix of guilt and curiosity. The narrator never waved back. There was nothing left to say, but Karen wasn't finished. Pride like hers doesn't break, it festers. She began spreading rumors again, this time claiming that the rancher had bribed officials and manipulated evidence. She called emergency meetings that no one attended. The HOA clubhouse sat dark and empty most evenings, its lights flickering like the last embers of a dying fire. One evening, the narrator noticed headlights again on the distant ridge, not near the gate this time, but on the county road that bordered the property. For a moment, it seemed like déjà vu, but instead of confrontation, there was only silence. Whoever it was lingered, watching, before driving off into the night. It wasn't until the next morning that the narrator learned what had happened. Karen's SUV had been repossessed. The bank had seized it after months of unpaid dues and mounting legal debt. Her home was next. Whispering Oaks' residents had voted her out as HOA president. She was no longer in power, but she wasn't about to leave quietly. The narrator could sense it. The story wasn't over. Karen was humiliated, cornered, and desperate people rarely go down without trying to drag someone else with them. That's when the narrator decided to reveal the final piece of the plan, the part no one, not even Karen, had seen coming. Because buried beneath years of property deeds and dusty county maps was a secret that would change everything. The rancher didn't just own the gate. They owned the very road Whispering Oaks was built around, and soon everyone, including Karen, was about to find out. The winter morning broke cold and sharp, the kind of day when frost clings to fences like glass and every sound seems to echo a little longer. The narrator stood by the ranch road, looking out toward Whispering Oaks. From a distance, the subdivision appeared, peaceful again. Snow-dusted roofs, smoke curling from chimneys, and a stillness that seemed almost innocent. But beneath that calm, the neighborhood was unraveling. The HOA was collapsing under its own weight, its members too divided, too angry, too ashamed to hold it together. Karen, once their proud president, had been stripped of her title after the financial scandal. The homeowners had called an emergency election, and the vote was unanimous. She'd lost everything, her position, her reputation, and even her SUV. But humiliation can be a dangerous fuel. While the rest of the community tried to move on, Karen was quietly plotting a comeback. The narrator, however, was several steps ahead. For months, while the court battles raged and the HOA flailed, the narrator's attorney had been working through county records, old land surveys, archived plat maps, and dusty title books that dated back nearly a century. What they found was staggering. Whispering Oaks' main access road, the one that wound through the subdivision and eventually met the ranch's private gate, wasn't public at all. It had been carved out decades earlier as part of a private ranch road system, back when the land belonged entirely to the narrator's great-grandfather. When the developer purchased land to build Whispering Oaks, they had bought parcels that bordered the ranch, but not the road itself. Through a clerical oversight, the developers had assumed the road was included. It wasn't. The ownership never transferred. Legally, the entire stretch of pavement leading into Whispering Oaks was still part of the ranch property. The discovery hit like lightning. The narrator held the proof in their hands: deeds, surveys, and notarized maps, all filed and confirmed by the county assessor. The road that Karen had claimed was a community easement didn't belong to her, or to the HOA, or even to the county. It belonged entirely to the ranch. Every inch of it. Every curve, every culvert, every mailbox that lined it. It was the ultimate irony. For years, the HOA had lorded its power over the rancher, filing complaints, sending letters, and issuing threats, all while using a road they had no right to. Now the narrator owned the very ground beneath their polished driveways. The plan that had begun as a simple act of defense had turned into something far larger, a legal weapon capable of dismantling the HOA completely. The narrator didn't act immediately. They understood the value of timing. Instead, they watched. They let Whispering Oaks struggle, let the residents turn on each other, let Karen's absence leave a vacuum that no one could fill. When the new HOA president, a nervous, well-meaning man named Dean, finally reached out to clear the air, the narrator agreed to meet. The meeting took place at the edge of the property, near the new reinforced gate. Dean arrived alone, shivering in the cold, clutching a folder of papers that looked far less official than he probably hoped. He apologized for everything: Karen's actions, the harassment, the damage. He assured the narrator that the HOA wanted peace. The narrator listened in silence, nodding occasionally, saying little. When the moment was right, they handed him a single document, a copy of the official land record showing that the entire access road belonged to the ranch. Dean's face went pale. He flipped through the pages, scanning the highlighted lines, reading the legal description again and again. The realization hit him like a blow. Whispering Oaks had no legal right to its own entrance. Within days, the panic spread. Emergency meetings were called again. Homeowners demanded answers from what was left of the board. Some refused to believe it. Others accused the developers of fraud. Karen, though no longer part of the HOA, saw an opportunity. She began spreading rumors that the rancher was blackmailing the neighborhood, claiming the documents were fake. But deep down, she knew the truth. The county confirmed the record's authenticity within a week. The ranch's ownership of the road was indisputable. The developers had failed to transfer the title, and the HOA had been operating under a false assumption for over a decade. Every time Karen or one of her neighbors had driven home, they'd been crossing private property. Every HOA improvement, pavement repairs, landscaping, even the decorative sign at the subdivision's entrance, had been built on someone else's land. The revelation exploded across the community. Local news outlets picked up the story. HOA built on wrong land, the headlines read. Cameras rolled through Whispering Oaks, capturing images of shocked homeowners standing by their mailboxes, reading notices from the county. The HOA's insurance company pulled out. Their lawyers resigned. Their funding froze. And through it all, the narrator remained calm. They didn't gloat. They didn't make threats. They simply filed one more motion with the court, this time to formally restrict access. The motion stated that, effective immediately, Whispering Oaks residents would require written permission to use the road, pending negotiations for an easement agreement. Karen's reaction was immediate and explosive. She appeared at the gate again, screaming into the wind, demanding answers, calling the narrator a liar. She filmed herself ranting for social media, claiming rural corruption and land theft. The video went viral, but not for the reasons she hoped. Viewers across the country mocked her, dubbing her Gate Crash Karen. Meanwhile, residents of Whispering Oaks began reaching out to the narrator directly, not with anger, but with apology. Some offered to pay for road rights. Others simply wanted to coexist peacefully. Slowly, the rancher began to draft terms, reasonable ones that would allow them access for a small annual maintenance fee. But before any agreement could be finalized, Karen made one last move. Late one night, she returned to the ranch road with a small group of her remaining supporters. They tore down one of the private property signs, shouting into the darkness about freedom and ownership. What they didn't know was that the narrator's security cameras were rolling, and this time, the footage wasn't just for documentation. It was for prosecution. The next morning, sheriff's deputies arrived at Karen's house with a warrant. She was charged with trespassing, vandalism, and destruction of property. The footage was undeniable. The very woman who had spent months accusing others of illegality was finally being held accountable. The HOA tried to distance itself, claiming she'd acted alone. But it was too late. The damage was permanent. Whispering Oaks was now the laughingstock of the county, its reputation in ruins, its finances gutted, its leadership disgraced. The narrator stood at the gate once more, watching as county workers replaced the damaged sign. The steel bars gleamed in the morning light, unmoved, unbroken, unyielding. Beyond them, the road stretched into the distance, silent and still. For the first time in years, peace had returned to the ranch. But the narrator knew better than to call it an ending. Because when pride like Karen's is wounded that deeply, it doesn't disappear. It festers in the dark, waiting for one last chance to strike back. Winter melted into spring, but the chill between the ranch and Whispering Oaks never thawed. Snow gave way to muddy ruts and patches of green, and while the land seemed to come alive again, the air around the neighborhood was heavy with resentment. The HOA was a shell of its former self. No leadership, no funding, and no credibility. Yet from that wreckage, one voice still refused to be silent. Karen Whitmore had boasted nearly everything. Her position, her car, her influence. Her court cases had drained her finances, her neighbors had turned their backs, and her online rants had made her a local joke. Still, she wasn't done. Defeat to her wasn't an ending, it was an invitation to escalate. At first, it began subtly. The narrator started noticing unfamiliar vehicles parked near the edge of the ranch road late at night. Headlights would linger in the distance, cutting through the fog, before vanishing into the subdivision. Gates left open, fence posts loosened, small but deliberate acts that spoke of someone trying to provoke a reaction. The sheriff's office responded when called, but without direct evidence of who was behind it, their hands were tied. The narrator knew who it was. Karen had started a campaign of quiet retaliation. She couldn't win in court, but she could still make life uncomfortable. She began whispering to new homeowners, feeding them lies about the rancher extorting the community. Flyers appeared in mailboxes claiming the narrator had stolen the road. Social media groups, once dormant after the scandal, buzzed again with anonymous posts painting the ranch as the villain. But what Karen hadn't realized was that every one of her moves was being tracked, documented, logged, and stored. The narrator had grown methodical in their response. Each rumor, each trespass, each suspicious vehicle was noted and reported. Evidence was being built quietly, piece by piece, for what was coming next. The rancher's patience had become their sharpest weapon. One evening, a call came from the new HOA president, Dean. His voice trembled with exhaustion. He admitted that Karen had been stirring up chaos again, holding meetings in her home, convincing a handful of bitter residents that they could take back the road. She'd promised them that she'd found new evidence proving the land transfer decades ago had been fraudulent. Of course, it was a lie, but it was enough to reignite the fire. Within days, Karen's small group of loyalists began acting out. They placed orange construction cones on the ranch road as if to claim ownership. They sent threatening letters to the narrator's lawyer, filled with legal jargon copied from the internet. They even planted signs reading "Community Access, HOA Maintained" at the end of the private drive. The narrator didn't remove the signs. They let them stand, knowing what was about to come. Because while Karen was busy rewriting her own version of history, the county assessor's office had finalized something far more powerful. The rancher's full ownership of the access road had been certified, recorded, and published publicly. The document was now visible in the county's digital records, accessible to anyone who searched for it. It wasn't just a private matter anymore. It was official law. But Karen was too blinded by her vendetta to see it. Her retaliation reached its peak one humid night in May. The narrator was awake when the security alert came through, motion sensors triggered near the main gate. On the screen, headlights appeared again, bouncing over the dirt. A familiar white SUV came into view, not hers this time, but another one, driven by one of her supporters. Behind it followed two more vehicles. They stopped by the gate, and silhouettes stepped out, flashlights in hand. They began cutting the lock. The narrator didn't move. They didn't shout or run outside. They simply made one phone call to the sheriff's office and waited. Minutes later, the night lit up in red and blue. The trespassers froze mid-act as deputies swarmed the area. The security footage, time-stamped and crystal clear, left no room for argument. Each of them was detained, questioned, and released pending charges. Karen, who had orchestrated the whole thing from her porch according to one of the drivers, was arrested the next morning. When she was brought in, she was furious, screaming about conspiracies, waving crumpled printo, cuts of fake land records, insisting that this isn't over. But for the first time, there was fear in her eyes. Real fear. The kind that comes when someone realizes they've finally lost control. The arrest broke whatever influence she had left. The few residents who still supported her turned quiet, embarrassed and anxious. Whispering Oaks' new leadership immediately issued a statement denouncing her actions and apologizing publicly to the rancher. Local news picked up the story again, labeling her the HOA queen who couldn't quit. Yet the narrator didn't celebrate. They knew the damage she'd caused, emotional, financial, and reputational, would take time to repair. Still, there was a quiet satisfaction in knowing that the truth had prevailed without ever stooping to her level. Weeks later, when Karen was finally released on bail, she came face to face with the world she'd destroyed. Her home had been foreclosed. Her reputation was gone. She was banned from attending HOA meetings, forbidden by court order from contacting the narrator, and under investigation for misuse of community funds. Whispering Oaks had moved on without her. But Karen wasn't the type to accept silence. She vanished for several days, and whispers circulated that she'd left town. The narrator didn't believe it. People like her don't disappear quietly. They linger. And sure enough, on a windless night not long after, a figure appeared once more at the gate. She didn't touch it this time. She just stood there, staring at the steel bars under the dim glow of the ranch's security lights. The narrator watched from the porch, unseen. No words were exchanged. No confrontation came. After a long moment, Karen turned and walked back into the darkness, swallowed by the night. It should have felt like closure, but something about it felt incomplete. Because while the war between the ranch and the HOA seemed finally over, the narrator couldn't shake the feeling that one last truth was still buried beneath the surface. Something deeper than property lines and court filings, something that connected everything that had happened from the start. And that truth was about to come to light. The sun rose slowly over the fields that morning, casting long golden streaks across the quiet land. For the first time in months, the ranch was utterly still. No distant hum of engines, no shouting voices from the other side of the fence. Only the soft rustle of wind through dry grass and the rhythmic creak of the barn doors swaying on their hinges. It felt like peace, real peace. But peace on a ranch, much like justice, doesn't come without cost. The narrator knew that too well. What had started as a single broken gate had spiraled into a war that consumed an entire community. The fields bore the scars of tire ruts and dug-up soil. The neighbors bore the scars of betrayal and pride. And somewhere among all that ruin, a woman named Karen Whitmore had lost everything by her own hand. After her last late-night visit to the gate, Karen had disappeared again. Her house in Whispering Oaks sat dark and empty, foreclosure notices fluttering against the front door like tattered flags. The HOA had dissolved what little was left of her influence, rebranding under a new name in a desperate attempt to shed the stain of her reputation. The new board worked quietly, humbly, sending a letter of formal apology to the narrator and offering to fund repairs for the damage their former president had caused. The narrator accepted the apology but refused the money. They didn't want payment. They wanted peace. And yet, even as the dust settled, there was unfinished business, the final trap that had been set long before anyone knew it existed. Months earlier, during the research into property deeds and old maps, the narrator's attorney had uncovered something curious buried deep within the developer's original documents. A clause, small and almost unreadable, that detailed the transfer of maintenance responsibility for the Whispering Oaks access road. It had been written in vague, misleading language, so vague, in fact, that the developers had unknowingly violated county regulations by building without, securing a legal easement. That discovery meant one thing. Not only did the HOA never own the road, but the developers themselves were still financially liable for every repair, accident, and incident that had ever occurred along it, including Karen's crash. It was the final piece of leverage, the quiet card left unplayed, until now. The narrator's attorney filed the necessary paperwork. Within weeks, the county issued formal notice to the developer's company, demanding backdated taxes, penalties, and restitution for unauthorized construction on private land. It was a staggering sum, enough to make headlines again. The story reignited, drawing reporters back to the dusty ranch road where it all began. Local news ran the headline, HOA Scandal Expands. Developer faces legal fallout over private road. The narrator watched from their porch as the world buzzed with renewed fascination. But unlike before, they stayed out of the spotlight. They had no interest in fame or revenge. They'd set their trap quietly, waited patiently, and let arrogance destroy itself. That was enough. Meanwhile, whispers began circulating about Karen's whereabouts. Some said she'd moved out of state to live with relatives. Others claimed they'd seen her working at a small-town hardware store 2 counties over. But one rumor stood out. The kind that travels through coffee shops and courthouse hallways like smoke. According to one of the deputies who had handled her trespassing case, Karen had tried to file an appeal against her charges, claiming new evidence and hidden corruption. But when she was asked to provide proof, she had nothing but a stack of faded maps and photocopies of the same fake documents she'd been waving around for months. Her case was dismissed within minutes. It was over. Truly over. As summer stretched across the valley, life returned to normal. The narrator repaired the fen, restocked the feed, and focused once more on the simple rhythms of ranch life, the kind that don't depend on lawyers, judges, or public opinion. Every so often, a car from Whispering Oaks would drive by slowly, the new residents cautious but friendly, their windows rolled down to wave in peace. The gate stood firm and untouched, a silent monument to everything that had happened, a boundary not just of land, but of respect. The cameras remained, though the narrator hardly checked them anymore. There was no need. The road was quiet. Then, one late evening in July, a letter arrived. No return address. Just the narrator's name, written in hurried, shaky handwriting. Inside was a single page. It was from Karen. The letter wasn't angry. It wasn't even defiant. It was a strange mix of apology and justification, as if she were trying to make sense of everything herself. She wrote about how she had only wanted to protect the community, how she'd felt cornered and taken advantage of, and how she'd lost herself in trying to prove she was right. She ended with a single sentence. You built that gate to keep people out, but maybe it was me who needed to be kept in. The narrator folded the letter and placed it in the old desk drawer in the ranch office beside the stack of legal papers that had documented the entire ordeal. There was no anger left, only pity, and perhaps a trace of understanding. Some battles aren't about land or law. They're about pride. And pride, when left unchecked, destroys everything it touches. Weeks later, the county finished repaving the road under a new maintenance agreement. This time, officially recognizing it as part of the ranch's holdings. Signs were installed on both ends. Private property, access by permission only. No one objected. No one challenged it. Whispering Oaks had learned its lesson. As the narrator stood by the gate that final evening, the sun dipped low over the horizon, washing the fields in gold. The steel bars gleamed faintly in the fading light, strong and unmoving, yet not unfriendly. It wasn't just a barrier anymore. It was a symbol of how far someone will go to protect what's theirs, a symbol of the cost of arrogance, and above all, a symbol of what happens when truth, patience, and quiet resolve meet entitlement head-on. Whispering Oaks still stood in the distance, smaller now, humbler. The HOA was gone, replaced by a cooperative group of neighbors who preferred conversation over control. The road between them and the ranch remained private, but open, by permission, by respect, and by understanding. And as the last light faded, the narrator locked the gate one final time, not with anger, but with peace. Because sometimes, the best revenge isn't in what you destroy, it's in what you protect, and what you prove can never be taken.